getting into verse 3, uh, he shifts a little bit. So Isaiah will go back and forth between Israel and Judah being blessed, and then also them being cursed as a result of their actions. He's going to really focus on Judah's wickedness in chapter 3. He talks about just right off in verse 1. For now the sovereign, the Lord's house. From now the sovereign, the Lord of hosts, is taking away from Jerusalem and from Judah support and staff, all support of bread and all support of water. There's going to be this famine. They're going to be like lacking basic supplies. We're not even talking about milk and honey right now. We're talking about bread and water. And this is, of course, going to be as a result of their wickedness. So, throughout these chapters, as we're teaching our kids, we don't actually need to get caught up in the small details of Isaiah's poetry, because that can be really confusing. When we get into the metaphors that he's using, they're not going to be our metaphors. If you can imagine, and I'll use this throughout other trainings as we get into highly symbolic books, but you can imagine a couple hundred years in the future, maybe a newspaper getting discovered from our day and describing an election as being won in a landslide. That's an intuitive metaphor for us, right? They won it in a landslide. But maybe that's not an intuitive metaphor for people further down the road. And you can imagine what they think about that metaphor, how all of the confusing interpretations that they might come up with there. We face that same challenge with Isaiah. He's from a different time, a different place. He's speaking a different language. He's in a different cultural context. So we don't need to get caught up on all of the tiny little symbols, and that's going to exhaust our students if all we're doing is going verse by verse. Okay, what does this mean? What does this mean? Focus on the big picture with Isaiah. It's going to be really helpful. Chapter 3, he's calling out Judah. Okay, these resources, this land of abundance that I've given you as a result of covenant, you're not going to even have bread and water. There's going to be some tough days ahead of you. Okay. And that can apply in Isaiah's immediate future with conflicts with Israel, Syria, and Assyria. But it's also going to look further down the road to like Lehi's day when Babylon's going to come in and completely destroy Jerusalem, carry off its inhabitants. Right. That's where Lehi and his family flee. So he goes through in chapter 3. The Lord is speaking here, and he's pretty accusatory, and he's saying, I'm not going to be your healer. I'm not going to come in and save you in your iniquity when you've disregarded me and my covenant. um, and throughout these kind of doom and gloom chapters, we can help our students to think of how through our own iniquities we can accept burdens onto ourselves that we don't need, right? And that even when the Lord wants to forgive us and he wants us to um be happy and successful and all of those things, that even then he can't make our choices for us, right? That wouldn't be agency. The Lord can't choose a make us choose something that's going to be good for us. We have to willfully or willingly choose that for ourselves. And it's kind of the lesson that Isaiah is trying to get the people of Judah to see right here. Um, he uses these examples of how Judah has become so wicked, and I think this is really important to understand what kind of wickedness they're actually participating in. Um, he talks about in verse 16. Um, Actually, we'll start in verse 13. It says, "The Lord rises to argue his case." Right? What justifies the Lord in maybe destroying Jerusalem? Well, he's going to argue his case here. The Lord enters into judgment with the elders and the princes of the people. He's talking about the leaders of the people. Um, it is you who have devoured the vineyard, the spoil of the poor in your house. What do you mean by crushing my people, by grinding the face of the poor, says the Lord God of hosts? he's really calling out the leaders of the people, the priests and the princes and the kings. And they're, instead of using their position of power and of influence to care for the covenant people of the Lord, they're grinding upon the faces of the poor. He goes on in verse 16. This is remember in chapter 3, says, because the daughters of Zion are haughty and walk with outstretched necks, glanting wantingly with their eyes, mincing along as they go, tinkling with their feet. The Lord will afflict with scabs the heads of the daughters of Zion. These women of this upper class in Jerusalem are so vain. They're more concerned with their own appearance and their own attractiveness and vanity than with the welfare of their brothers and sisters in the city. And how quickly that vanity, that beauty gets swept away with an invading army, right? Where there was beauty, there's going to be scabs, is what the Lord is saying here. And it's not just, he's not just calling out the women there. This is an entire class of people who are of the covenant people who are supposed to be doing what's right and blessing not only their own people but the whole world. And instead, they're more focused on their own convenience, their own comfort, their own vanity, their own attractiveness and status. And the Lord's not going to have it. Okay. And so that's what we see out of chapter 3. Um, in chapter 4, he switches again. He switches his theme again, where he goes from Jerusalem and Judah being wicked to he starts in verse 2. He starts talking about that on that day, the branch of the Lord shall be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the land shall be the pride and the glory of the survivors of Israel. That this vanity and the destruction that's going to come from it that we see in chapter 3, that's not the whole story. The Lord has plans and is faithful to those plans and covenant for Israel. He says, whoever is left in Zion after the wicked get destroyed or the wicked flee or are carried off, whoever is left in Zion and remains in Jerusalem will be called holy, everyone who has been recorded for the life in Jerusalem. So the wickedness, it's not the whole story. It will bring natural consequences, but even in the devastation that comes as a result of the wickedness of the people in Jerusalem, things like being carried away to Babylon, even then he'll bring these images of new life, of a new gathering, a new covenant people that he'll eventually call the remnant. Um, Chapter 5 is a really beautiful chapter. You can kind of, I would imagine being able to do something like what we just did in 1 or 2 classes for the first 4 chapters. You can maybe pick out a theme and trace them along the different chapters. Like, okay, let's look at Israel's wickedness today. Now we're going to look at his promises to Israel. Um, and you could compare those. There's all kinds of ways to do those first 4 chapters. Chapter 5 is a great chapter to help them to understand those themes through this poetic narrative that he gives us. And it's called the Song of the Vineyard. And the whole role of chapter 5 is the Lord's people are the Lord's vineyard. And that's a familiar theme from the Book of Mormon. And he's saying, I love my vineyard. I've labored in my vineyard. I've tried my best to make my vineyard fruitful. What have I not done for my vineyard that that I should have done, right? Haven't I been a faithful steward? And and then um, he says, and now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem, this is in verse 3, uh, judge between me and my vineyard. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done? When I expected it to yield grapes, why did it yield wild grapes? I've done my job, but you guys are bringing forth wild fruit. And then he uses this image to say, if it's going to bring forth wild fruit, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take down the walls protecting my vineyard. I'm going to take away the resources that I'm giving to my vineyard, and it's going to come in, and it's going to be trampled and destroyed. And it's this really, really um, familiar image of Israel as a vineyard, right? We see something like that in Jacob 5. But it's nice and I think easy to follow if you can help your students see, okay, this is the Lord talking. He's talking to Jerusalem as if they're a vineyard. They can understand Isaiah if you give them just a little bit of help there. And then I think it's pretty easy to say, okay, what has the Lord done for us in our lives? Are we really needing to wait on the Lord uh, it, for Him to do something that He hasn't already done? Or has He given us the resources that we need to be successful and happy and blessed in our lives? So, chapter 5 is really great, the Song of the Vineyard.